Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more United States Supreme Court, the U.S. Judicial Branch. Today we are looking at the Chief Justice for the Fuller Court, Melville Fuller. Yeah, we get a look at who he was individually. This is from Oye. Melville W. Fuller, born and raised in Maine, and attended Bowdoin College. He read law after graduation and passed the bar following a 6-month stint at Harvard Law School. Even back in these early days, if you've been following the series, a lot of the uh, Supreme Court judges and people like that were still going to Harvard and Yale, and yeah. Though Fuller was headed for a promising career in Maine, he elected to move west and settled in Chicago, combining politics and law, and managed Stephen Douglas's presidential campaign against Abraham Lincoln in 1860, later serving in the Illinois House of Representatives for 2 years. He also maintained a thriving legal practice specializing in real estate problems. So, he early on managed the political campaign for Stephen Douglas, who was the president. I think he was the general election opponent of Lincoln, not necessarily party opponent. But anyway, yeah. And remember, it wasn't necessarily an agreement that, oh, they should have slavery. Oh, back at, we've talked about this before. Back in those days, it was more a view on states' rights versus national rights. Because remember, I've spoken about this as well. When the United States was fighting for independence, they wanted it to be states' rights. That's why we had the Articles of Confederation, a failed governing document before the Constitution. Because we would realize that there is a need for a strong federal government. But yeah, practice law, serve in the Illinois State House of Representatives, real estate law, interesting. President Grover Cleveland offered Fuller appointment as Solicitor General, which Fuller would decline. Grover Cleveland then selected Fuller as for the Chief Justice position. Senate confirmation took 3 months. There were objections about Fuller's sympathies for big corporations, and Northern Republicans questioned his loyalty to the Union. In the end, however, Fuller was approved. So, yeah. This was in the early ages of the Gilded Age. We're going into the Gilded Age, so yeah. These giant corporations are already have started being an issue, a problem. What exactly was the year that he went in? I can't remember off the top of my head. Um, I hate that it does this. Disappears all the information when you're trying to read it. Because it's like, oh, you want it smaller. I don't care. I want it easier to see. How about this? Do you have the exact years? He's on the court. $1888. Okay. So yeah, smack dab in the Gilded Age. You're talking your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, um, Vanderbilts, all that. Let's see. Fuller presided over a court that was barraged by constant criticism. In fact, only the Warren Court was the subject of more abuse. The Warren Court, of course, Earl Warren. Both courts actively injected their value preferences into the legislative arena. Yeah, the Warren Court, Earl Warren, was the ones that presided over the JFK trials and everything, trying to figure out what happened exactly. So, and of course, also being the JFKs, they presided a lot over civil rights issues and other things. Yeah. The 1960s was a tumultuous time. Fuller was an amiable leader who inaugurated the custom that each justice greet and shake hands with every other justice prior to the conference. The custom continues to this day. So, so when court convenes, uh, they come in and shake hands with each other. From Justia, Chief Justice Melville Weston Fuller, if you're curious what the W stood for, joined the U.S. Supreme Court October 8th, 1888, replacing Chief Justice Morrison R. Waite, and was born February 11th, 1833 in Augusta, Maine. He graduated from Baldwin College in Maine in 1853 and briefly studied law at Harvard Law School, although he did not receive a formal law degree. He was admitted to the Maine bar in 1855, but he soon left his home state for Chicago, where he entered private practice. Was a delegate to the Illinois Constitutional Convention in 1862. Remember, America's still expanding at this point. There's a number of states that have not been named states. And elected to the Illinois state legislature soon afterward. served there for only 2 years, after which he did not pursue political office further. However, he remained involved in the Democratic Party politics and attended several Democratic national conventions. President Grover Cleveland offered him the position of U.S. Solicitor General, but he declined. On April 30th, 1888, Cleveland nominated Fuller to the Chief Justice seat on the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Senate confirmed him on July the 20th in a 41-20 vote. So yeah, contested, but he would go through a lot easier than many other Chief Justices, or Associate Justices for that matter, taking the judicial oath in the early fall, and would serve as Chief Justice for over 2 decades. He started the tradition of justices shaking hands with one another before their conferences. As a jurist, Fuller often favored business interests and sought to blunt government power. He wrote for the court in striking down a federal income tax and limiting the scope of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Neither of these decisions has aged well. Yeah, knowing what we now know about the Gilded Age and the situation we are similarly back in, Fuller also ended up on the wrong side of history when he endorsed the aggressive application of substantial or substantive due process to economic regulations. He voted with the majority of the court in Lochner versus New York, which relied on the constitutional freedom of contract in striking down a state law regulating the working hours of bakers. The court would abandon the viewpoint epitomized by Lochner in the late 1930s. So out of the Gilded Age into the Great Depression. Endorse the aggressive application of substantive due process to economic regulations. So, economic regulatory laws must see their day in court, I guess, is what they're trying to push. The Fuller era also saw one of the most infamous decisions in Supreme Court history. Yeah, we've talked about the Dred Scott decision under an earlier Chief Justice. Another one of the bad decisions that would happen is Plessy versus Ferguson. After slavery, a lot of things were tossed out that, this must be this or this must be that, in an attempt to still keep former slaves underfoot. And the use of things like Plessy versus Ferguson, which endorsed the separate but equal principle in racial segregation, was one of these things. Yeah. Again, another horrible decision in American history. A lot of horrible decisions I'm finding. But yeah, I'm wondering, how are they so bad nowadays? You start looking back and it's like, damn, they're horrible then too. Fuller voted with the majority in this case as well, although only a single justice, John Marshall Harlan, dissented. The court repudiated Plessy over half a century later in Brown v. the Board of Education, essentially ending the idea of separate but equal things. And that's, of course, when you started to have the military make sure these young African American children can go to whichever school, because there was such hate put forth by others. On a lighter note, Fuller spurred a surprising amount of controversy over his mustache. Newspapers nationwide argued about the merits of the mustache during his confirmation process and beyond. A New York newspaper worried that it would distract attorneys arguing cases before the court. Wow. While an Ohio newspaper felt that it would prove useful in shutting his mouth. Wow. At any rate, Fuller kept his mustache, and several later justices brought mustaches to the court as well. Fuller would die on July 4th, 1910, Independence Day, in Sorrento, Maine, and was buried in Chicago. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White replaced him on the Supreme Court. And White's interesting because he starts out, unlike most of your Chief Justices, as an Associate Justice. Many of your Chief Justices are straight assigned, but White goes from Associate under Fuller to Chief Justice on his own. But anyway, we're talking about Fuller for now. Let's go ahead and dig into his Britannica article. It isn't horribly long. Melville Weston Fuller, born February 11th, 1833 in Augusta, Maine. Died July 4th, 1910 in Sorrento, Maine. Was the 8th Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, 1888 to 1910, whose amiability, impartiality, and rare administrative skill enabled him to manage court conferences efficiently and resolve or forestall serious disputes among the justices whom he superintended. So, amiable, friendly, impartial, showing he's not trying to vote for any one particular group, trying to actually be an impartial justice. So yeah, interesting. Most people, even in positions like the Supreme Court nowadays, don't seem to have the ability of impartiality. So that's interesting. And rare administrative skill, enabling him to manage court conferences efficiently and resolve or forestall serious disputes among the justices whom he superintended. Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Samuel F. Miller, two outstanding members of the Fuller Court, called him the best presiding judge they had ever known. So, despite some of the controversial decisions he would make, apparently he was well liked and tried to keep people in peace, working together. So, yeah. We've talked about him in college, attending Harvard Law School. Was a newspaperman in Augusta for a time before being admitted to the bar in 1855, and from 1856 practiced law in Chicago. Was elected as a Democrat to the Illinois Constitutional Convention in 1861 and to the State House of Representatives for Illinois in 1862. So, wasn't in politics long, but integral to Illinois' birth as a state. It had been a territory for a while out because Chicago was one of those big ports. But yeah, integral to the statehood of Illinois. Prominent at the Chicago bar, but unknown nationally, he was appointed Chief Justice by President Grover Cleveland in 1888, successfully administered a court that comprised of such justices as Holmes, Miller, Stephen J. Field, Joseph P. Bradley, and John Marshall Harlan, all of whom overshadowed him in either intelligence or forcefulness. So even though he was overshadowed by how intelligent his associate justices were, he was able to keep the peace, keep the court together, working well. Again, had some bad decisions under his court, but yeah. He wrote two important opinions, both in 1895, U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company, in which he construed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 so narrowly as to prevent its application to almost any business except transportation, and Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, in which he declared the federal income tax of 1894 unconstitutional. So that's what they were talking about, him being very pro-business, often ruling in favor of things to help the businesses. While serving as Chief Justice, he also was an arbiter of the Venezuelan boundary dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain from 1897 to 1899. Interesting. And a member of the Hague Court of International Arbitration from 1900 to 1910. So yeah. And the Hague's in what? Modern day I'm wanting to say something like Belgium, but it may be a more neutral country like Switzerland or something. Or it could be, I'm also thinking Netherlands too. I, and I could be completely wrong in all three guesses. But yeah. But essentially, the Hague is the site where international law is taken care of. So even before there was a United Nations, he helped deal with that. So interesting. Anything else we want to add from the Wikipedia article? I say, yeah, February 11th. Which is funny because it's also my brother's birthday. Okay. So, yeah. Working as a politician and working for other politicians during the start of the Civil War because he backed Stephen Douglas in the Douglas Lincoln race. Worked for Stephen Douglas, as a matter of fact, on his campaign. So, but yeah, agreed with the majority of that the Constitution forbade states from enforcing wage and hour restrictions on businesses, contending that the Due Process Clause prevents government infringement on one's liberty to control one's property and business affairs. He's trying to say, oh, the company has the right to decide the wage and hours. But we know how that bullshit goes. They'll work a regular person to death if they can because they don't care. Plessy versus Ferguson, like I said, one of the worst decisions. It's right up there with the Dred Scott decision. Argued in insular cases that residents of the territories are entitled to constitutional rights, but dissented when in the U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. I think I wrote about this individual when I was talking about notable names in Asian American history. The majority ruled in favor of birthright citizenship, but Fuller dissented. He says, I disagree, even though he had said before that, yeah, he's entitled, those born in the territories are entitled to constitutional rights. So he's kind of trying to have it both ways on that one. Like I said, there are some clear instances of racism, even though those people themselves may not have considered themselves racist. Uh, he may have been more pro-right to own slaves than we thought, because he opposed both abolitionists and secessionists. And of course, abolitionists are like, free the slaves, there shouldn't be slavery. Secessionists are like, we should separate from the country. So he didn't agree with many in the North that slavery should end, but he didn't agree with many in the South that they should secede, arguing instead for compromise. Supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed Kansas and Nebraska to determine the slavery issue themselves. Again, as you can see, just always an attempt to say, you know, we can still live with each other, and kick the issue down the road. Like so many others before him, they did not want to tackle slavery. Even Lincoln didn't really want to tackle slavery, but he was kind of forced to when the states started seceding. Because even he was like, I don't really want to free the slaves. I just want a repaired nation. But he came to realize that the only way they're really going to force the South back is when they're battered and broken. And said, look, you're going to have to give up your ability to be slaveholders. Anyway, like I said, I'm going off on a tangent now, but supported military action against the Confederacy, but opposed Lincoln's administration's handling of the war, and decried many of Lincoln's actions as unconstitutional. There are some clear issues of this. I think it was Lincoln denied due process during the war. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln denied due process during the Civil War, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, which allowed the indefinite detention of individuals without trial. This action, taken during a time of rebellion, meant that the person suspected of disloyalty, aiding the Confederacy, or disrupting the war effort could be arrested and held by military authorities without being charged with a crime. So yeah, there are things you can still push back on Lincoln for. Suspending due process and suspending the writ of habeas corpus, which kind of connect in the same thing. But yeah, probably the biggest issue you could really push on Lincoln during the war. There are other things he did, but that one was probably the biggest, without a doubt. But yeah. So, this has been a look at Melville Fuller, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, 1888 to 1910. Presiding over the Gilded Age. Grover Cleveland nominated him, and he lasted in through Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know if he lasted after Roosevelt. He might have. Roosevelt became president when McKinley was shot, but I think he still served his own 2 terms. I think. I'm not sure on that. I know he served 2, but I'm not sure if it was just continuing Roosevelt and then his own term, or if he was elected twice. I know he completed McKinley's, because he was McKinley's vice president. Anyway, like I said, Melville Fuller. We'll end this video here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, later.